Welcome, everybody. I am Rachel Weintraub, Executive Director of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. We are so appreciative to partner with the Center for Progressive Reform in hosting this second webinar on Project 2025 and the regulatory process. CSS is a coalition of over 200 organizations united in the belief that an effective regulatory system is essential to protecting the public interest. CSS is co-chaired by Public Citizen and Consumer Federation of America, and our executive committee includes the AFL-CIO, the Center for Progressive Reform, the Economic Policy Institute, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. The Center for Progressive Reform and the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards have been hosting a series of webinars about the impacts of Project 2025 on our nation's system of regulatory safeguards. In recent months, Americans have learned about the many ways that Project 2025 would demolish our constitutional system of checks and balances and threaten individual rights and freedoms. So far, though, an important part of this story has not been adequately told. How Project 2025 could continue the decades-long campaign to hobble the federal regulatory system and the critical role it plays in our democracy and ensuring a healthy, inclusive economy. Our webinar today will focus on provisions in Project 2025 aimed at weaponizing the regulatory system to advance goals of promoting an authoritarian presidency. These aspects of Project 2025 are unique in that they seek to strengthen the powers of the regulatory system by undermining the independence of agencies, increasing political control of decision-making, and abusing agency enforcement authority. A few logistical details. First, this webinar is being recorded. Second, please put the Zoom in speaker view or spotlight folks if you can, so you can best see the speakers. If you are not a panelist, please keep your video off and mute your microphone. If you don't mute, I will need to mute for you. Please use the chat to introduce yourself and to indicate that you have a question after the initial round of questions. We will have questions and answers after that initial round. Please post in the chat that you would like to ask a question, and I will call on you to ask a question if time allows, or read your question. I'm so grateful to our panelists who have dedicated their time already and are able to participate in this conversation today. I'm going to summarize their very impressive bios. First, James Goodwin, my partner in this effort, who is the Policy Director at the Center for Progressive Reform. He joined CPR in May of 2008, and prior to joining CPR, James worked as a legal intern for the Environmental Law Institute and for Ecologics Group, Inc. The Center for Progressive Reform is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that conducts independent scholarly research and policy analysis and advocates for effective collective solutions to our most pressing societal challenges. Nina Mendelsohn is the Joseph L. Sachs Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan, teaches and conducts research in the areas of administrative law, environmental law, statutory interpretation, and the legislative process. She is also a senior fellow of the Administrative Conference of the United States, has served as one of 3 U.S. Special Legal Advisors to the North American Free Trade Agreement Commission on Environmental Cooperation, and is a member scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform. Before joining the Michigan Law faculty in 1999, Nina Mendelsohn served for several years as an attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice's Environment and Natural Resources Division, litigating and advising other federal agencies on legislative and policy matters. She also participated extensively in federal legislative negotiations. Joe Spielberger, welcome, is the policy counsel at POGO's Effective and Accountable Government Team, where he advocates before Congress and the executive branch to strengthen whistleblower rights, protect a merit-based civil service, and promote government ethics and transparency. Prior to joining POGO, Joe worked at the Public Policy Council for the ACLU of Maryland, in state and local government for the Maryland House Judiciary Committee and the Baltimore City's Mayor Office of Human Services. John Gollinger serves as the democracy advocate for Public Citizen. He's an attorney, advocate, and organizer who works to strengthen political spending and influence disclosure, increase corporate transparency and accountability, and drive Public Citizen's advocacy around money and politics. Prior to joining Public Citizen, John was an assistant district attorney and investigator in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, where he led criminal investigations into public corruption. And previously, John ran advocacy and election campaigns for environmental, labor, and public health organizations, including the Sierra Club, SEIU, and the American Lung Association, and served as the statewide consumer program director for CalPIRG. So now we turn to the panelists to begin our conversation today. I reiterate my warm welcome to all of our panelists and to the audience. Okay, first we're going to go to James. James, while there has been a lot of attention to Project 2025, can you share what it is, who wrote it, and what the goals are?
Yeah, so briefly, Project 2025 is something a lot of us will be familiar with. It's just a transition project. A lot of nonprofit organizations come up with those, right? Ours does. But ours doesn't end up in the national news. So what makes this one different? Well, one is its sheer comprehensiveness. 900 pages long, gets into just incredible amount of detail on every policy issue you can think of. But it's not just the detail, it's also the extremeness with which they approach these different issues. Almost everything you can think of is covered, and there's just an extreme recommendation for how to address that, extremely conservative. The project itself was led by the Heritage Foundation, a really well-known conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. And it put this together with over 100 other conservative organizations. And what this was meant to symbolize is that Project 2025 is like the coherent vision of the modern conservative movement. It consists of 4 pillars, as they explain. The one that we're all familiar with and what we're probably going to be talking about the most today is the mandate for leadership. That's the 900-page long policy manual. There's also what's called the LinkedIn for Conservatives. This is where they're coming up with, it's supposed to get 20,000 different conservative people to serve in various positions throughout the administrative state. There's an academy, as they call it, which is a series of like YouTube videos, which is meant to train these folks to be ready to take over positions in the administrative state. And the 4th pillar is this thing called the 180-day playbook. Has not been made public, but it's supposed to be like the executive orders, the actual proposed regulations, the things that a conservative president would do within the first 180 days, like from the starting gun of the inauguration.
Thanks so much, James. And we're going to try to make this not all doom and gloom, but there is a lot in here that is incredibly concerning. A lot of the commentary around Project 2025 has described it as a conservative plan to deconstruct the regulatory system, but it also actually does the opposite in some ways, because it includes a lot of recommendations that would actually strengthen parts of the executive branch. Can you talk about those aspects of Project 2025 and more generally why it's significant and potentially concerning?
Yeah, so if you follow political debates for the last 40 years or so, it's been, to oversimplify, it's been, conservatives are in favor of smaller government and liberals, progressives, whatever, in favor of bigger government, right? The Project 2025, does many things, but it also sort of disrupts that kind of narrative. There's a lot of deconstruction of the administrative state in there, right? They do call for dismantling agencies, privatizing things that will sound very familiar to people who follow political debates. But there's also a lot in there about literally building an authoritarian administrative state, right? So what things like we see in Hungary and Brazil under Bolsonaro. And the thing about an authoritarian administrative state is it requires a lot of state capacity, right? If you want to control the details of people's lives, that requires a lot of state capacity. And so you need to build up agencies in very specific ways, or very specific aspects of agencies to carry out that role. And so you see this pervade every chapter, or almost every chapter of the Project 2025 mandate. But where it's really sort of described, or like the thesis is really most clearly described, is in a chapter written by Russell Boyd, who is, without a doubt, the scariest guy in the conservative movement. He wrote the chapter on Office of Management and Budget, and he sort of lays out this thesis for Project 2025. And he says, we're going to take all the power in the executive branch, the administrative state, and we're going to consolidate it within the Oval Office, within the president, right? And then, which is scary, right? And then he says, and then the president's going to like return to the people. Of course, they don't really explain how that happens or what they mean by returning stuff to people, because like very clearly, who counts as people in this document is not all of us, right? So, and we'll get into that in more detail.
Thank you so much, James. Now I'd like to ask Professor Mendelsohn some questions. Welcome. So first, what is the Federal Vacancies Reform Act? Why is it important for protecting good government values like accountability and the rule of law?
Okay, so thanks so much for having me. I'm sorry, I'm hearing some feedback. How's the audio at your end?
It sounds good.
Okay, great. So the Federal Vacancies Reform Act issues are all about putting acting officials in senior agency positions. So just to remind you, Senate confirmation for senior agency posts, including cabinet secretaries or other agency leadership, it's required by the Constitution or statutes or both. And Senate confirmation is a critical check for agency leadership because it makes sure that we have qualified people in these jobs, not just people who get their jobs through patronage or because they're, loyal to some set of views that isn't widely shared. Make sure that agencies will be responsive to congressional concerns as well as presidential concerns. If you will, that senior agency appointees are democratically responsive. Also gives Congress an opportunity to conduct some agency oversight at the time of confirmation, to keep an eye on how agencies are doing. But of course, Senate confirmation is never going to be instantaneous. And that brings us to the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. It's an important compromise. So what the statute does is give a president limited latitude to temporarily put acting officials in senior agency posts while awaiting Senate confirmation of a presidential nominee for that job. I'm happy to talk about this in much more detail if people are interested, but the short version is only certain people can serve. Importantly, for our purposes, first assistance to a job can be an acting official. Someone who's been in the agency at least 90 days at a higher level can be an acting official. Someone who's Senate confirmed in another post, and only for limited periods of time, although candidly, I think the permitted times for the Federal Vacancies Reform Act are pretty generous. So the Federal Vacancies Reform Act is really meant to reinforce the requirement of Senate confirmation, which is the key requirement. Presidents can temporarily rely on acting officials in these top roles, but then what they're supposed to do is duly nominate someone to serve and then seek Senate confirmation. And all presidents have used these tools, but one of the things that Project 2025 seems to be doing is hinting strongly that an incoming administration should rely on these tools a lot more heavily than perhaps one might think a president should do.
And that really is what I want to get to in the second question. Can you provide some examples of how Project 2025 seeks to short circuit the Federal Vacancies Reform Act or abuse loopholes that it actually provides?
Right. So it contains some important signals that an incoming President Trump, say, might try to avoid the check of Senate confirmation on top agency officials, either by over-relying on acting officials or by choosing what I might call shadow acting officials. What Project 2025 repeatedly says is, let's appoint a robust cadre of political staff just below senior levels in the event of vacancies. And there are specific mentions in the chapters on the Department of Homeland Security and on housing and urban development as well. So that's the coded language. We're going to have a lot of political staff just below senior levels. In other words, put in a lot of people in jobs that don't formally require Senate confirmation. Why might this allow an incoming administration to abuse the Federal Vacancies Reform Act? First, it allows people to put, political officials to be put into so-called first assistant jobs from which they can immediately be an acting senior agency official without Senate confirmation. Even if they've never previously served in the government, even if they've never assisted anyone, and even if they've never been Senate confirmed to any post. So I don't want to take too much time, but people may remember Ken Cuccinelli from the Trump administration. When the Senate confirmed director of USCIS resigned, Ken Cuccinelli, the former Attorney General of Virginia, got hired into the federal government into a newly created job, the principal deputy director. That made him the first assistant, and he could then take over as acting director of USCIS, even though he'd never previously been an assistant to anyone, and he kind of vaulted over the previous deputy director. And he was running the agency, even though he would have had no meaningful chance of Senate confirmation if he'd been nominated. Lots of examples, and I think we might expect to see this again if Project 2025 gets implemented in this way. Let me just comment on a second general strategy that I think we should expect to see deployed. And then if people want to talk about it more during Q&A, I'm happy to do that. The second strategy likely to be used is to bypass the Federal Vacancies Reform Act altogether and use what's called a delegation strategy. What happens here is you've got someone serving in the agency, again, someone who's a political appointee just below the senior levels, no Senate confirmation required. And the head of the agency writes a document that says, say, I hereby delegate the powers of the director of the USCIS to this person or to this office that the person is serving in. That person is not technically an acting official under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, and they might not be eligible to be an acting official under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. But their claim is we can still exercise the power of the office because of this delegation document. And the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service were run actually through the whole Trump administration through devices like these. William Perry Pendley, I don't know if anybody remembers him. He claimed to lead the Bureau of Land Management under a delegation document like this. And there was a faint effort to nominate him, but it was clear it wouldn't go anywhere because he'd publicly advocated to sell off all public lands. Nonetheless, the claim was, I've got this delegation document, I can exercise the authority of this office. Again, why do we care? Because this kind of strategy may allow political officials who might not be qualified or may have other issues of bias or not be responsive to what we might consider broadly held public preferences to exercise, important agency powers without going through the confirmation process. So I'll pause there and people can talk about this more if there are questions.
Thank you so much. Really concerning, and definitely, I think we all remember some of these examples and the consequences of that. So thank you. Want to now turn to you, Joe. Can you tell us a little bit about the merit-based system for the federal civil service and why it exists?
Yes, certainly. So our merit-based federal civil service has been an evolving institution for over 140 years now that has certainly not been always a straightforward or a necessarily inevitable path, but it's been a result of slow and deliberate deliberations. And it really stems out of the spoil system of the 1800s when federal employees were largely chosen for their positions based on party affiliation and personal connections, which really fostered a widespread culture of corruption, infighting, and everyone mainly looking out for themselves instead of really serving in the best interests of the people. And then, of course, a major catalyst that really spurred the civil service reform movement was the assassination of President Garfield by a disgruntled office seeker that led to Congress passing the Pendleton Act in 1883, which really kind of created the basic foundation for this new system. It said that at least certain government positions should be awarded competitively based on merit. It also prohibited political firings, for example. Congress later codified a just cause standard to prevent unwarranted firings and provided for the right of civil servants to blow the whistle to Congress by passing other critical bills like the Hatch Act. They sought to prevent people from using their positions to engage in partisan political activity. And then, of course, another real fundamental piece of legislation was the Civil Service Reform Act, which was passed at least partially in response to Watergate, that provided a lot of additional employment protections for civil servants, specifically the right to appeal adverse employment decisions to the Merit Systems Protection Board. And so over the course of these many decades, it's really allowed us to create a government that is staffed by nonpartisan career civil servants, people with deep expertise, who are protected when they speak out against abuse of power, who generally serve continuously throughout both Republican and Democratic administrations. This helps to ensure that there's not this widespread turnover between administrations. Agencies can maintain institutional knowledge and expertise. There's continuity of government services and benefits, which is especially important to the extent that it requires really close coordination between federal, state, and local governments and stakeholders. And more fundamentally, this system exists to ensure that federal employees are certainly hired fairly because of their qualifications for the job, not because of ideology or party connections. They're committed to their oath of office to uphold the Constitution and rule of law. They can do their jobs free from undue political influence. They can provide accurate information, even if it's not what a president or a political appointee wants to hear. And they can more safely blow the whistle again when they witness corruption and abuse of power. And so fundamentally, this helps to ensure that we have a government that serves people fairly, that's responsive and accountable to the needs of the public, regardless of who they are, where they live, or how they vote. And so when we talk about a lot of these threats to the federal civil service, in many ways, we're really talking about rolling back more than a century of progress, and really what that means, not just for federal workers and federal agencies and government operations, but really the impact that this is likely to have on different communities all across the country.
Thank you for setting that framework for the civil service. As many of us have been learning about repeatedly, one of the most infamous recommendations of Project 2025 is its call to reinstate Schedule F. Can you describe some of the harms we could expect from Schedule F and Project 2025's other attacks on the federal civil service?
Yeah, so really briefly, of course, Schedule F was this policy that was briefly in place under the Trump administration that was really designed to, in many ways, break the civil service by stripping job protections from these nonpartisan career civil servants to make it easier for them to be fired for almost any reason and replace them with partisan loyalists and political operatives. It was estimated that Schedule F would likely impact tens of thousands, up to 50,000, 100,000 employees or more. And perhaps more importantly than just those sheer numbers, it would really be a tool that a president or administration could use to target and gut key agencies or departments. So just as one example, the Office of Management and Budget, which of course plays such a critical role in overseeing the work of government agencies and administering the federal budget, they attempted to reclassify 88% of their entire workforce into this new category. And it was reported that officials in the administration wanted them to take the lead for other agencies to follow. And so we can only imagine the impact had this policy had time to be fully implemented and had other agencies really followed in OMB's lead. And now we're really talking about the impact to 88% of federal employees across every single agency. And so this is a policy that's likely to impact anyone whose work touches issues like healthcare, safety net programs, labor protections and workplace investigations, climate regulations, disaster response, national security, highway and aviation safety, food and water safety, which really means that all of the services and benefits and protections that we rely on to live safe and healthy lives could be fundamentally compromised or at risk. So for example, it's possible that federal disaster relief could be upheld or rerouted, to a red state or a blue state. If you're conducting medical research, scientific research and analysis, those findings and analyses could be censored and manipulated. If you're an older American receiving Social Security, it's possible that your benefits, might not be fairly processed or delivered based on where you live. For veterans who are receiving really critical services and benefits from the VA, what impact might they experience if decisions about those services and benefits are made by political operatives, people who might have a financial stake in privatizing VA services, instead of people who are really committed in understanding how to really uphold and provide that highest standard of care. If an administration sees you or people in your community as a political enemy, they could order the IRS to audit you. They could order the Justice Department to investigate or prosecute you. And so I think the examples are, we can go down a long list of different examples, but really, in short, this is a policy that would enable a president to really utilize the full array of government resources to protect themselves, target political enemies, and force through really harmful policies without congressional oversight or public input or approval. And we said that Schedule F is this foundational component of a lot of the other threats that we see in Project 2025, because in order to enact this type of agenda, it's really dependent upon having a very willing and complicit federal civil service filled with partisan loyalists, people who will obey any order or violate the law, even regardless of the consequences. And then the last thing that I'll just note is that, in addition to all of the, focus that especially we at POGO and certainly a lot of other groups on this call have paid to Schedule F, it's important to note that this is only one way that an administration could achieve some of these goals. And so just a few other examples that come out of Project 2025 include office relocations, like we saw under the Trump administration when they relocated the Bureau of Land Management and agencies within the Department of Agriculture, kind of on a political whim. Abuse of the security clearance process as a means of purging the Department of Defense or intelligence agencies, ideological loyalty tests. And so there are a lot of different ways that an administration could really, kind of get at the same goals, but again, with the effect of really, purging the civil service and packing federal agencies with partisan loyalists who will willingly obey any order, and certainly will not speak out or stand in the way to prevent them from enacting this really harmful agenda.
Thank you, Joe. Really harrowing what you describe and the examples and how far-reaching this would be for government and what Americans expect from government. So thank you. Now I want to turn to enforcement. John, thank you for being here. An important norm in our regulatory system is that enforcement decisions should be insulated from political control. Can you talk about why that is so important?
Sure. So I'm supposed to be the comedy relief to give the Positive. I don't know if I can do that. I will mention before I answer your question, I'm in the Public Citizen Capitol Hill office, which some of you may know is on Pennsylvania Avenue between 2nd and 3rd. So pretty close to the Capitol and Supreme Court. And then our 2-door down neighbor is the Heritage Foundation. It's their smaller, huge townhouse, not their main office anymore. But it's, if you read the long Politico article a month or two ago, sort of about how Project 2025 has blown up a little bit, and that reporter got some real access. The Heritage office 2 doors down is what he basically called their frat house, that they were too embarrassed to show him. He was supposed to have an interview with a guy who's doing like the LinkedIn that I think James referenced, conservative LinkedIn, and they turned it down because it was apparently a mess. Public Citizen's office is neat and tidy. We're happy to have Politico come by anytime. So to your question, so in a word, why is it important that enforcement decisions not be politicized? In a phrase, public trust. And so I see that, was it Catherine put in the chat, sort of related, that public service is a public trust. And it's important that people who take these roles swear an oath to a higher power than the political appointee or the elected official who appointed them. And by the same token, enforcement decisions are, I think it's reasonable to say, looked upon by every American as being supposed to be based on the rule of law, on sort of taking the law as written and enforcing it or not, and making a judgment call that's effectively objective. And when that's not done and people see that, public trust is lost. And it's incredibly difficult to win back. By way of example, and Rachel, you mentioned in your introduction, my job before I came here was in law enforcement. I worked for 3 years investigating public corruption in San Francisco. I was very busy. And one of the first things I saw was that how delicate a lot of the judgment calls are in whether to pursue potential investigation or not. As an example, before I came on, one of the reasons the DA hired me is that the FBI and US Attorney in January 2020 marched into City Hall, arrested Mohammed Nuru, who was the very powerful longtime director of public works. And anyone familiar with how cities run, public works is often huge political and financial base and of great importance. And this person was very close to the mayor and the power structure. And because it looks as if because those decisions to do that investigation and arrest him were not made on a political basis, someone with that much potential implication to the rest of the city was able to be indicted, ultimately convicted, and is currently serving time. I also want to note, as people have observed in the last few weeks in New York City, something very similar has gone down. I think it's not a stretch to say that if there was a different president and a different US attorney in New York who didn't believe that public corruption investigations should be pursued other than against your political enemies, that might have gone very differently. So just to sum up on this question, potentially what Project 2025 would have enforcement decisions be is not just the fox guarding the henhouse, but the criminals becoming the cops. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you provide some additional examples of how Project 2025 threatens this norm and actually seeks to politicize enforcement decisions? Sort of the opposite of what you were just talking about, essentially.
Sure. Well, I would point folks to the Department of Justice section in particular, and because the enforcement decisions around, well, what's proposed in there by the author of that section is a guy named Gene Hamilton, who was a right-hand person to Stephen Miller, who I'm sure everyone's familiar with from the last Trump administration and other things. And so in that section of Project 2025, the Justice section talks about a couple things I thought I'd highlight. One is it proposes to politicize voting and election-related enforcement. So obviously, the Justice Department's voting rights, civil rights section was designed and is valued at taking action when people's rights to vote are abridged or denied or curbed in some way. What Project 2025 proposes, and there's actually a very specific example, is that state election officials, in the example of the chapter cites the Pennsylvania Secretary of State in 2020. It says that if election officials effectively do too much to allow people to vote, that might extend beyond what the authors of the document think was allowed, they should be criminally prosecuted for doing so. So the document calls for the Pennsylvania Secretary of State to be prosecuted for allowing mail-in voters who voted in 2020 and had some typo or date not filled out, something quite a little improper in their ballot, to not, the Secretary of State allowed them to vote provisionally, the people who caught the error and wanted to still vote. And the document, the Project 2025 document, says that for a series of reasons that was not permissible, and therefore that election official should be criminally prosecuted for letting people who were registered to vote, legitimate voters, all those things, cast their ballot. That's one example. Another is prosecuting local district attorneys for really just for ideological reasons. And that's something that people are familiar with Ron DeSantis doing, effectively doing by removing them in Florida and pulling them out. The last example I'll give, and this is maybe a little more goes to what's been discussed by some of the other panelists, is this is not in the document, but as part of Project 2025, and this was referenced, the Presidential Administration Academy, which is like their training ground for the potential unqualified people to swoop in if Schedule F is implemented. So the Presidential Administration Academy put forth, I think it's 24 or so videos that ProPublica and Documented got hold of, and it's been published. And if you haven't looked at them, and you really want to be scared, you should watch those. But one of them is it's investigations and oversight, and a couple high-level people, Heritage, another guy, specifically call for every inspector general, all 74 of them, who are supposed to be people that in a few different ways are allowed to make their own objective investigations of corruption and fraud, all be replaced, and Trump cronies of whoever the next president is be put in there instead, using the theory that the unitary executive allows president just to wipe them out. But again, that goes to having someone who can watchdog basic fraud and abuse, doesn't matter what party it is, being replaced with political cronies. And again, that circles back to undermining, ultimately that would dramatically undermine public trust that government's working on behalf of the people.
Thanks so much, John. I wanted to reiterate to folks, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and I can read your question or call on you. But I now want to go to sort of our round two, which is open to each of you. And let's start with James. What we've just heard is an alarming plan by Project 2025 to weaponize the regulatory system, to advance an ultra-conservative agenda. What are some of the groups or communities in the United States that would be at greatest risk of harm if this plan is implemented?
So like I said, there's a very distinctive vision that they're trying to create through the administrative state. It's one that's involves a lot of hierarchies. I think I can put it that way. So patriarchy, heteronormative sexual identity, racial hierarchy, Christian nationalism, all these sorts of things. Or these are the hierarchies it tries to establish, right? And so anybody who doesn't sort of align with those hierarchies or fall at the bottom end of them are at greatest risk. So, I spend a lot of time reading news and essays about Project 2025. I've written most of it, or read most of it, and I can tell you, for example, women are like in the crosshairs. The LGBTQ plus community, transgender folks, immigrants, anybody who's non-white. These are all people. So you remember earlier when I summarized the thesis of Project 2025 about how it's allegedly the president was going to get all this power and then return it to everyone. Well, yeah, but that's not quite right, because a lot of the people I just described, people who don't fit certain conservative ideals, don't get that power, right? In fact, the point of it is to use the power of the state, of the administrative state, to subjugate them.
Thanks, James. Professor Mendelson, do you want to answer this question about which communities would be most at risk?
Sure, please call me Nina.
Okay.
So I think the key takeaway for me is that a lot of the modifications that we're seeing in Project 2025 that we're talking about this afternoon really work together. So it will be, I think Schedule F plus putting lots of newly appointed political folks in charge of major agencies. It's going to be a lot easier to do things like politicize prosecutions and politicize enforcement actions. And let me add to that, politicize individual decisions that an agency may make, such as giving or not giving grants or emergency assistance, giving or not giving drug or medical device approval, all sorts of decisions. So for example, people who would benefit from an enhanced enforcement that isn't taking place here. I'm thinking environmental justice communities like Southwest Detroit, which is one of the 3 most polluted zip codes in the country. Enforcement is politicized because that's a blue area. That's obviously going to impact that community. For people who would be harmed by targeted enforcement, Nixon famously asked the IRS to audit his enemies. That is a prospect that is much more likely the more politicized the strata of officials is that oversees enforcement and prosecution decisions. So, again, you could be thinking about recent immigrants, lots of people who might be concerned about more politically driven enforcement and prosecution decisions.
Thank you. Joe, do you want to answer this?
Sure. I touched on this a little bit briefly in my opening remarks, but really quickly, some of the communities that POGO has really focused on with our Schedule F work has been the impacts to veterans, senior citizens, and people living in rural communities. And certainly, when it comes to veterans, of course, there are approximately 637,000 veterans who still work for the federal government, whose jobs and careers would be further at risk under Schedule F. But more importantly, I'm really thinking about the millions of veterans who are receiving really critical services and benefits, especially as it relates to very serious life and death issues from the VA. And just thinking about the impact as one example, folks might remember there's the so-called Mar-a-Lago 3 under the Trump administration. These 3 kind of like business executives who were dues-paying Mar-a-Lago members who received unprecedented access to high-level VA officials and had an undue influence on VA policies. And so, just thinking in terms of kind of like the widespread impact, again, when people are in these very influential positions, not because of their qualifications, not because they are committed first and foremost to providing veterans with the care that they deserve, but people who have conflicts of interest, who have financial interests in privatizing VA services. And so again, we are talking about, in many cases, veterans who are experiencing trauma, very serious physical, mental, psychological injuries, exposure to toxic burn pits, all of these other impacts of their service, whose care would be just further at risk under policies like Schedule F when we don't have qualified and committed people in these really important positions.
Thanks, Joe. John?
I want to add something that maybe a slightly sort of different take on it, which is, people, has been said, people who are, who are out of power and, victims in one way or another of bad behavior of the powerful, obviously corporations and businesses, whether it's pollution, child labor, or sexual harassment or discrimination of other kinds. But I also want to note, and this is more this ends up being more specific, but to powerful people. So people, a little dovetailing with what I said, that the public trusts that in law enforcement and investigations, whatever they may be, are done objectively and not politicized. But an example of where a White House that brought all the power to it and circumvented the existing sort of checks and balances, an example of how that can go awry and mean that victims of sexual violence can have their complaints or clear cases overlooked is those complaints against Justice Brett Kavanaugh that Senator Sheldon Whitehouse just called out in a stunning report he released yesterday. I don't know if anyone's read it. I just was reading it before this call, called Unworthy of Reliance. So Senator Whitehouse put this out just, I think, yesterday as a 4 or 5 year study of what happened in the, people will remember this very well who followed this closely, but the supplemental FBI investigation that was done at the behest of the Judiciary Committee after the allegations of Christine Blasey Ford and others were brought. The senators asked the FBI to do a week, 10-day investigation to look into them. So according to White House's report, the FBI tip line got thousands of tips. All of them, according to this report, went to the White House, not Senator Whitehouse, the Trump White House, and were put in a drawer and never heard from again. Which that's stunning to me. If true, I mean, this is Senator Whitehouse's report, and then the White House controlled the investigation, limited. What was sort of obvious is the White House limited the corners of what the FBI could look at, but it looks like there were actual leads corroborating evidence that the president, because they had the administrative power, that Project 2025 would give in a much broader fashion, was able to put all that in a hole. And the people who were victims of the alleged crimes did not get justice.
Thanks, John. That's a very intense example that I feel like we all experienced 5 years ago, and then it resonates deeply now too. There's a question from the audience, and I'm not sure that folks can answer, but can anyone discuss the threat to child labor protections, which are already under assault by many state governments?
I can take a first stab at it, because when I read the question, there were kind of, I guess, like 4 different buckets that kind of came to mind initially. One, I think, is just the rolling back of regulations against child labor, unsafe working conditions. The second bucket is, stop investigating and enforcing against meat processing plants, large agricultural industries, especially many of whom might be really big campaign donors. We can also see where agencies can doctor research findings into dangerous working conditions, threats of heat and climate, for instance. And then I think the last thing, which goes back to something that James was speaking about, is just really the lack of prioritization for people, especially people who are very vulnerable, and where we're talking about largely migrant farm workers. And so I think there are kind of the active threats of really rolling back those legal protections, and there are also those more passive threats where we're just not taking issues like these seriously based on who is primarily impacted.
Thanks, Joe. James, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the most incendiary sentences in all of the mandate for leadership, and I don't make that claim lightly, is it has this statement where it says, teenagers find dangerous work interesting, and why should the government get in their way and prevent them from doing that, right? Like, what? So basically, yeah, they're all on board with eliminating existing child or labor standards to protect or to prohibit kids under a certain age from working in certain dangerous professions, like meat processing, what have you. That is like one of the specific items on the agenda.
Thanks. Nina, John, do you want to take this too?
I think Joe and James have really covered it. There's a political commitment to reduce child labor protections, and Joe's really covered, as James has said, and Joe's really covered the methods by which they might do it. So yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, the same. I just wanted to add, I mean, there's a lot we actually don't know about what Project 25 plans to do, and this was, James touched on this at the beginning. So we have their 900-page report that we've all read, multiple times, much as we can stand, or summaries of it. But the actual day-to-day playbook, which could include much more detailed plans on child labor, on environmental enforcement, and actions on everything. Their 180-day playbook is, per their own description, their actual day-by-day playbook to implement it. Who they're going to put where, what they're going to move first. Executive orders have been written, presumably, and are sitting over there. So there's a lot we don't know. If anyone on this call has a copy, please send it to us. Some members of Congress did write the Heritage Foundation directly and asked for it, and said, if you're proud of it, show it. But they got no response. So that's all to say, not to scare further, but they have a much more detailed plan that this isn't just a policy book that may or may not be implemented. It's presumably like a football playbook, or to pick your sport, that's going to be ready to go on January 20th, if that's what happens.
Thanks. So sort of building on your response, John, I want to move to another question, but really, given the incredible importance, and obviously for CSS and CPR and so many others on this call, the regulatory system is incredibly important to ensuring that public interest goals are achieved. Given Project 2025's impact on the regulatory system, what alarms you the most? Whether it's something that you identified already that is in sort of your purview of expertise, or is there something else that you've not yet mentioned that you actually think is even possibly more alarming? Joe, let's go over to you first.
Sure. So in terms of the specific issues that POGO focuses on, I mean, there are a lot of examples that we're definitely alarmed by, specifically, I think, with regards to the Department of Justice and what that means for issues like mass surveillance, privacy, civil liberties, different communities across the country. But for us, really, like, I always come back to this foundational threat of Schedule F, where just kind of like fundamentally, refusing to violate the law, for instance, could be seen as insubordination. There will certainly be no tolerance for any type of dissent. On a larger scale, when we completely silence whistleblowers, it's hard to imagine, how much abuse of power and corruption will just go on completely unaddressed behind closed doors. But I think in addition to kind of like those larger threats, I think we can identify a lot of smaller impacts that, are kind of like a result of this widespread chilling effect across the federal government. And so if you feel like your job and your career is directly threatened, how quickly will you start self-censoring yourself, tampering down research findings and analysis, watering down different recommendations, because you're not going to risk upsetting, the wrong people, for instance. And so over time, I think it's easy to see this slow degradation of government services and operations, which would only lead to more distrust that the public has in the federal government, and certainly to the extent that we're talking about, potentially seeing the weaponization of government services and benefits. It's easy to see how that leads to just more distrust and conflict among different communities across the country. And I think that's a very dire threat for all of us, wherever we are.
Thanks, Joe. Nina, what would you say is the most alarming?
It's really hard for me to rank. I feel that there are kind of very significant long-term risks of the sorts we've already been talking about, which is about, hollowing out the federal government in important ways and discouraging public servants who've long been committed to serving the public, the law, the Constitution, encouraging them to go. I think I'll just add two more pieces to the conversation. One is smaller, and I think we just don't know its full implications. I think besides politicizing enforcement, we also have to worry about politicizing a lot of the adjudication that happens inside agencies. So agencies are often responsible for imposing penalties or issuing orders to improve health, safety, or the environment. And I think that's something we need to keep an eye on. That might matter for child labor enforcement if employers aren't facing significant enough penalties for violating those laws. Certainly matters for environmental enforcement. And at a kind of a higher level, I think a huge challenge here it's something that I'm thinking about is, are we going to have an effective response to climate change? And we don't have an effective federal government, a well-functioning federal government, that's really going to hamper us in that way as well.
Thank you. John?
I would certainly say, broadly, the knocking down the walls that make independent agencies valuable, whichever that might be, whether it's SEC, or as I've mentioned, the inspectors general, the FBI, is also, while not fully independent, largely for a long time, for a good reason, went from being misused and abused by presidents to being, largely able to, carry out its work and investigate crimes and pursue corruption, even against very powerful people of both political parties. And so one thing I didn't mention that the Justice Department section of the Mandate for Leadership calls for is, on day one, an immediate review of all active FBI investigations and terminating any that are, quote, unlawful or contrary to the national interests. Can you tell me what the next administration thinks would be contrary to the national interests, or would it be their interests? So that concerns me in all directions.
Thanks, James. What do you find the most alarming?
Oh man, how much time do you have? So
1 minute. We have 1 minute.
Okay, I'll be quick then. So related to John's point about a specific example or illustration of what John is talking about with independent agencies, the Federal Communications Commission, right? This is the agency that issues licenses to like broadcasters and stuff like ABC and different radio stations and what have you. It really terrifies me, the notion of that becoming heavily politicized. And I know that sounds like a bit pedestrian, Trump is already like threatening, like this is something that's already being threatened. Like Trump has already said he's going to take away NBC's broadcast license and stuff. I know it sounds pedestrian, but you look at like sort of the modern day examples of authoritarian regimes, Hungary, Russia, Brazil, what have you. And what was so critical to like consolidating power within the authoritarian regime was just totally eliminating any semblance of like an independent media, right? And funneling everything through a state media. So it seems kind of small, but like if you just sort of trace out like the authoritarian playbook, like that's the thing that's, and it's plausible, right? And we have like historical precedent for it. So I will point to that.
Thank you. Well, our time unfortunately has come to an end. We can definitely talk about this for a lot longer. Thank you all so much for your participation. To the panelists, Joe, James, John, and Nina, thank you so much for your time, all the work going into this. For James, for being a partner, an amazing partner, CSS and CPR, executing these webinars and really providing information that others really haven't in terms of the impact on our regulatory system that the entire public interest community depends upon to bring about the change that we need. Thank you to our audience, and also thank you to Alden for helping me with the tech. Thank you all very much. Hoping everyone is safe with the hurricane and many other things going on in the world, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.